He commanded pilots who were forbidden to do the one thing that makes a fighter pilot famous: no breaking away, no chasing the enemy home, no personal kill count, stay glued to the bombers, or answer to him. Benjamin O. Davis Jr., 31 years old, West Point graduate, commander of an all-black fighter group that most of the American Air Command did not want in the fight at all. And in the summer of 1944, the senior officers above him were already trying to pull his men out of combat, claiming they could not do the job. So Davis gave his pilots an order that cost them glory. While white fighter groups turned their pilots loose to run up scores and make aces, Davis chained his men to the bombers they were paid to protect. Fewer kills, fewer headlines, fewer medals for the men who wanted them most. Then something happened that nobody at that Air Command saw coming. The bomber crews started to notice, and one of Davis's own Mustangs would end up flying with two words painted on its side that turned the whole insult inside out. If you're the kind of person who thinks a story like this deserves to be remembered, do us a small favor, subscribe and tap that bell. There's a lot more coming, and every one of you who sticks around helps us keep telling these stories the right way. The trouble reached General George Marshall's desk in the autumn of 1943, and it arrived dressed as a professional assessment. Colonel William Momyer commanded the 33rd Fighter Group in the Mediterranean, and the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first Tuskegee-trained pilots to reach a combat theater, had been placed under him. Momyer put his verdict down on paper. The black pilots lacked aggressiveness. They lacked discipline in the air. They wore down under the strain of combat and couldn't be counted on the way white squadrons could. The recommendation that climbed the chain of command from that report was simple enough. Pull the 99th out of the fight, move them to some quiet corner where they could do less damage. Here's what makes that moment bite. Davis had commanded the 99th himself. He had taken them into their first action in June of 1943, a dive-bombing run against the fortified island of Pantelleria, and he had flown alongside them through the hard weeks that followed. In all that time, nobody, not Momyer, not one officer above him, had ever told Davis his men were failing. He found out the unit was under review only after the paperwork to shut it down was already moving up the ladder. To understand what that report was really asking, you have to understand the man they'd handed it to. Davis had gone through West Point in the class of 1936, and he finished 35th out of 276 for 4 straight years there. Not one of his fellow cadets would speak to him outside the line of duty. They called it the silence. He roomed alone. He ate alone. No one said a word to him that regulations didn't force out of them for 4 years, inside the academy that was supposed to be forging the brotherhood of the American Officer Corps. Davis walked out the far end of that with something most men never have to build: a flat, cold refusal to let other people's contempt tell him what he was worth. So when the Army moved to bury his old squadron on the strength of a single report, Davis didn't file a memo and wait for the system to be fair. He went straight at it. He flew home to the United States. Instead of working his case quietly through channels, he called a press conference at the Pentagon and defended his men in front of reporters. Then he walked into a War Department committee that had been convened to study the whole question of black troops in combat, and he sat down to be questioned. Picture the room: a table of senior white officers, most of them already half decided, and one black colonel across from them. And riding on the next few hours was not just one squadron, but every pilot the program had ever trained or ever would. And the doubt had already jumped the fence into the press. That same autumn, a national magazine put the story of the 99th's supposed poor showing in front of its readers. So the question was no longer moving quietly through classified channels. It was in print, in public, framed as an open verdict on the whole experiment. Davis walked into that committee room knowing the court of opinion outside. It had already been handed the case for the prosecution. Davis's argument wasn't emotional, it was arithmetic. The 99th had been thrown into the war as a brand new squadron with no combat veterans to season the young pilots, in a theater where the white units around them had spent months learning from men who'd already flown a tour. Measure the 99th against that reality, Davis argued, and the record held. He asked the committee for the one thing the report against him had skipped completely. Look at the actual numbers. Set them honestly beside what a green-white squadron had done under the very same conditions. The committee did exactly that. The War Department ordered a statistical study of the 99th combat record, matched against comparable white squadrons flying the same P-40 Warhawks in the same skies. When the figures came back, the squadron that supposedly couldn't fight looked no different from the white outfits beside it. On paper, in cold statistics, the committee couldn't wave away. The 99th had done its job. The push to pull them out of combat fell apart. The 99th kept its place at the front, and the rest of the Tuskegee pilots, the 332nd Fighter Group that Davis had come home to lead, kept their orders for Italy. Then the men themselves answered the charge in the only language that ends the argument. Over the beachhead at Anzio, in the last days of January 1944, the 99th ran into German fighters and, across 2 days of fighting, brought down 12 of them. 12. The squadron that a colonel's report had painted as passive and easily rattled had just posted a 2-day score that any group in the theater would have been proud to put its name on. Now sit with the shape of what almost happened, because this is where the real weight of it shows. One squadron's supposed shortcomings were about to be used to write off thousands of men who hadn't yet flown a single combat mission. If the 99th had gone down in the files as a failure, that verdict would not have stopped at the 99th. It would have hardened into the official army finding on whether black Americans could fly and fight at all. And every cadet still training back at Tuskegee would have inherited it before he ever left the runway. No white fighter group in the entire war operated under that. A white squadron that had a rough stretch was a squadron that had a rough stretch. Davis's men were being told, in effect, that if they stumbled on behalf of an entire race. That was the cage Davis stepped into when he took command of the 332nd, not just the ordinary terror that rides in every fighter cockpit, a standard of proof that applied to no one else in the American Air Forces, where a single, ordinary bad afternoon could be filed away as evidence against millions of people who would never once meet them. The report was beaten. The burden it exposed didn't go anywhere. Davis carried it with him into Italy, into the cockpit, into every order he was about to hand down, including the one order that would cost his best pilots the exact thing they wanted most. That was the number that turned a fighter pilot into a legend. 5 enemy aircraft brought down in the air, and you were an ace, and your name ran in the papers back home, and the other pilots looked at you a little differently in the mess tent. Every young man who ever climbed into a fighter wanted that number. It was the whole romance of the job, the thing that separated the hunters from the drivers, and the way you got it was no secret. When the enemy showed up, you went after him. You broke away, you chased, you closed in, and you didn't come home until you had one more painted on the side of your airplane. Davis told his pilots they couldn't do it. The order was flat, and it was absolute. You stay with the bombers. When German fighters climb up to meet you, you do not go tearing off across the sky to run up your own score. You hold over the heavy bombers you were sent to guard. You break only far enough to drive an attacker off the formation, and then you come straight back. The bombers get home. That's the mission, not your name in the paper, not your 5th victory. The bombers get home. Now think about what that actually asked of a young man in a fighter cockpit. It asked him to watch a German fighter turn away, wide open, an easy score, the exact thing he trained years for, and let it go. To sit on his hands over a box of bombers while the chance every other fighter group in the theater was free to chase went sliding past his wingtip. White fighter groups turned their pilots loose to hunt. Davis chained his to the bombers. He was asking the men who most needed to be seen, the men carrying the whole weight from the first chapter, to give up the surest road to being seen at all. Here's the thing though, that discipline was the entire point, and Davis knew it cold. A bomber crew was 10 men in a machine that couldn't turn and couldn't run. When a fighter escort peeled off to chase glory, it left a hole in the screen, and German pilots lived by finding those holes. The escort group with the flashier scoreboard was very often the escort group that had left its bombers naked to do it. Davis had decided before a single mission that his men would be measured by something the record books barely tracked. Not how many of the enemy they brought down, how many of their own they brought back. he didn't get to ease into that idea either. In the early summer of 1944, Major General Ira Eaker, running the Allied air forces in the Mediterranean, pulled the 332nd out of the tactical work it had been doing for the 12th Air Force and moved it over to the 15th. Eaker wanted the group for one job in particular. He wanted it escorting his heavy bombers on the long strategic runs deep into German-held Europe. Of all the ways the American command felt about these pilots, that one is worth holding on to. The man in charge of the bombers asked for them. So on the 9th of June, 1944, Davis led 39 P-47 Thunderbolts off the strip at Ramitelli and pointed them north. The target that day sat near Munich, and the bomber stream they were covering was exactly the kind of fat, slow, irreplaceable target the German fighter arm still came up to hit in force. And come up it did. A large formation of enemy fighters climbed into the bombers, more of them than the escort had any comfortable answer for. This was the moment the order got tested for real. Every instinct in a fighter pilot's body says the same thing when the enemy appears in numbers. Pick one, dive, chase, score. Davis did the opposite, and he made his squadrons do the opposite. Instead of turning his pilots loose to go get famous, he read the attack coming in and moved his squadrons like a man closing doors, throwing them between the German fighters and the bombers, breaking up the runs, then pulling his pilots back onto the formation before the next wave came. Drive them off, come back, drive them off, come back. Nobody went hunting. Everybody held the line. The army wrote down what that looked like from the outside. The citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross that Davis earned that day put it in the driest possible language, and you should hear the restraint in it. Colonel Davis so skillfully handled his squadrons that in spite of the large number of enemy fighters, the bomber formation suffered only a few losses. Read that again. Only a few losses. Not none. A few. The Army's own award order, written to praise him, tells you plainly that bombers went down that day. The achievement was never that his men made the losses vanish. The achievement was that against a swarm of enemy fighters with every temptation in the world to break away and save themselves a slice of fame, his pilots held the screen so tightly that 10-man crews who should have gone down came home instead. And here's where the real bargain of that day comes clear. Every enemy fighter one of Davis's pilots didn't chase was a decision. It was a victory left unclaimed, a name kept out of the paper, a step away from ace that would never be taken. That restraint bought something, and the citation names it without meaning to. A few losses instead of many. The men who most deserved to come home famous were the same men Davis was ordering, mission after mission, to trade their own shot at fame for the lives of bomber crews they'd never meet, and who, at that point in the war, would not have thanked them for it. By the middle of that summer, the group traded its Thunderbolts for the P-51 Mustang, an airplane with the range to ride shotgun all the way to targets the older fighters could never have reached. And to sort friend from foe in a crowded sky, the ground crews painted the tails of those Mustangs a deep, unmistakable red. High above a bomber stream, that red was the first thing a nervous waist gunner picked out against the haze. It was just paint, chosen so crews could tell one fighter group from another at a glance. It was about to become the most trusted color in the 15th Air Force. That was the first wall, and Davis put it up himself, not the enemy, not the racism waiting back at the officers' club, his own order. He had taken the one path that could have made his pilots household names and closed it on purpose, because the mission was the bombers, and the bombers were everything. What he was building out of that self-denial, mission after quiet mission, through the summer of 1944 was a number of a completely different kind, and that number was about to start doing something no speech from Davis ever could. Lee Archer got the closest. Of every pilot in the 332nd, Archer was the sharpest shot in the air, the one man in the group who might have punched all the way through to the number that made a legend. He finished the war credited with 4 enemy aircraft brought down, 4, one short of the 5 that would have made him the group's first ace, and by some tellings, he had a claim on a 5th that the paperwork never quite blessed. Archer had his own flat opinion about why the count stopped where it did. Somebody up the line, he figured, just wasn't ready for a black man to be an ace. Whether that was the real reason or not, and people argued the records to this day, the shape of it fit everything else these men carried. The single number that would have forced the country to print a black pilot's name as a hero was the same number Davis's own discipline made nearly impossible to reach. That's the first pressure, and it sat on the best pilots hardest, the men with the fastest hands and the sharpest eyes, the ones who, in any white group, would have been racking up scores and giving interviews, were the ones being asked to hold formation and watch the glory float past. You could be the finest fighter pilot on the field and end the war with almost nothing on paper to prove it, because your commander had decided that proof lived somewhere else. Now stack the next wall on top of that one. These pilots weren't chasing greatness from some polished, well-supplied base. Ramitelli was a strip on the Italian coast, where the group shared the runway with local goats. When the fighters needed the extra fuel tanks that let a Mustang reach the far targets, the tanks weren't always there, and the ground crews had to improvise around a chronic shortage of the exact equipment the long escort runs demanded. The 332nd was still climbing out of the bottom of the theater's pecking order. Every other fighter group on the strategic runs had been in the war longer, and most already wore at least one unit citation for some past mission. Davis's group had none yet. It had come to the fight late, and it was being asked to prove itself with less gear from a rougher field than the white groups it flew beside. And every man on that field knew exactly what was riding on him, which is its own kind of weight to fly with. Off the flight line, the segregation that had trailed them from home trailed them all the way to Italy. Promotions came slower. The clubs and comforts that white officers took as their due were rationed out to black officers or simply withheld. The pilots of the 332nd understood, without anyone having to spell it out, that the future of every black American who might someday want to fly a military airplane was riding on how they handled the next target. Picture carrying that into the cockpit on top of the ordinary fear of being shot at. Most men are allowed to fail as individuals. These men had been told from the day the experiment began that they could only fail as a people. And here's the wall that hurt worst, because it was the one nobody could punch through with skill or courage. The thing Davis's men were actually good at was invisible. Think about what a perfect escort mission looks like from the ground. Nothing. The bombers went out, the bombers came home, and no story got written, because the story of the escort pilot who does his job right is the story of the disaster that didn't happen. Bring down 5 enemy fighters and leave your bombers to be torn up, and you're an ace with headlines. Bring down nothing and shepherd every bomber home untouched, and you're a footnote. The men doing the most valuable work in the sky were, by the very nature of that work, the men least likely to ever be seen doing it. It got worse than invisible. Sometimes the credit for their work walked off and pinned itself on somebody else. The 332nd wasn't the only outfit in the Mediterranean flying red-marked Mustangs. Another group, the 31st, painted red stripes on the tails of its P-51s too. And after the war, bomber crews would sometimes remember a red-tailed fighter saving their lives and hand the thanks to the wrong men. So even the gratitude, when it finally came, could drift to the wrong address. You do the job, you do it better than anyone, and the record of it either vanishes into a quiet return flight or gets misfiled under another group's name. That was the deadlock Davis was standing in the middle of by the late summer of 1944. His best pilots were denied the one score that made fame. His whole group was operating from the back of the line with the worst of the equipment, and the excellence they actually delivered was the kind that leaves no fingerprints. Every door out of that box was a door his men weren't allowed to walk through, or one that led somewhere the world would never look. There was one small, stubborn thing pushing back against all of it, and it was painted on the side of an airplane. Davis flew a P-51 Mustang with 2 words lettered on the fuselage, by request. Sit with how strange those words are, given everything pressing down on the group that flew under them. Here was a unit the Army Command had tried to disband, a unit judged unfit in writing, a unit flying from a goat field with borrowed together fuel tanks and no citation to its name. And the colonel's own airplane carried a claim that sounded almost like a taunt. Requested, wanted, asked for by name. When Davis first flew under those words, the world outside his group had done little to earn that language. It read less like a fact and more like a promise he was making to himself. This is the thing worth stopping on, because it's the quiet cruelty at the center of the whole escort mission, and it reaches far past these men and this war. We hand our loudest praise to the people who produce something we can see, the score, the trophy, the number on the board. The person whose great skill is that nothing bad happened on their watch gets no such moment, because you cannot photograph an absence. Davis had bet his men's entire reputation on exactly that kind of excellence, the invisible kind, and he was asking them to keep paying for it, mission after mission, on faith that a quiet number nobody was tracking would one day speak louder than every score they'd been forbidden to chase. The strange part is who finally started listening, not the War Department, not the committee that had grilled Davis, not the magazines that had printed the doubts. The record didn't turn because the brass changed its mind about black pilots. It turned because of 10-man crews riding in the bombers up ahead, men with the most direct possible stake in the question, men who had begun, mission after mission, to notice something about the fighters with the red tails that stuck close and never left. The weather did what no order from the War Department ever could. On the 29th of December 1944, a stretch of foul winter sky closed over Italy and caught 18 B-24 bombers a long way from where they were supposed to land. Low on fuel, boxed in by cloud, the crews took the nearest strip they could reach. That strip was Ramitelli, the home of the Red Tails. 17 of those bombers belonged to the 485th Bombardment Group, one to the 455th, and every man aboard them was white. So picture the scene that followed, because it's one no committee could have staged. White bomber crews, dropped by chance onto the base of the all-black fighter group, stuck there while the weather refused to lift, not for an hour, for 5 days. A crowded field, more men than it was built to hold, and no way out but to wait it out together. And the men of the 332nd did the thing that quietly undoes a lifetime of second-hand contempt. They took the visitors in, they fed them, housed them, shared what a rough forward base had to share, and for 5 days the pilots America had argued couldn't fly, and the crews they'd been protecting lived shoulder to shoulder on the same patch of Italian mud. 5 days is a long time to hold onto a second-hand idea about a man while you're eating his food and sleeping under his roof. Whatever these bomber crews had been told back home about black pilots, home was an ocean away, and the men actually in front of them were the ones who'd been flying cover over their heads. On a base already stretched thin, the 332nd stretched it thinner to make room. There was nothing grand about any of it. Cots found, meals split, weather cursed in common. The small, ordinary business of stranded men waiting out a storm together. And ordinary is exactly what did the damage to the lie. It's a lot harder to look down on a man after 5 days of depending on him to keep you fed and dry. Here's the part that turns the whole thing over. Before those bombers left, the 332nd slipped a note into each one. The message was plain. The red-tailed fighters these crews had been seeing overhead were theirs, and they were up there to bring them home. Think about what that note was really doing. For months, these pilots had been invisible, their best work vanishing into quiet return flights, their credit drifting off to the wrong group. Now, for the first time, they got to put their name on it, face to face, and then in writing. That red tail you trust up there, that's us. Remember it. And the crews did remember it. The name that came out of encounters like that one didn't come down from any general or any press office. It came up from the men in the bombers, the men with the most to lose, and it was about as far from the language of the disband order as you can get. They started calling them the Red Tail Angels. Angels from the same America that 18 months earlier had been drawing up paperwork to pull these men out of the war for supposedly not being able to fight. This is what the 2 words on Davis's Mustang had been waiting for. By request, stopped being a promise he'd made to himself and started being a plain description of what was happening. Bomber crews who'd flown under the red tails, who'd watched them stay welded to the formation while other escorts went chasing off after scores, began asking for them. Not because anybody ordered it, because a bomber crew learns fast which fighters actually keep them alive. And word of that kind travels through a bomber group faster than any rumor. The crews who'd been to Ramitelli, who'd seen the red tails up close, knew exactly who they wanted overhead the next time the target was deep and the fighters would be waiting. Now understand what that request actually was, because this is the moment the whole thing turns inside out. The white crews weren't asking for the red tails out of charity or politics or some change of heart about race. They were asking because they wanted to live. When your own survival is the thing on the table, you stop caring about the color of the man flying cover for you, and you start caring about one question only. Does he stay? The 332nd had answered that question the same way on every mission, for months, at the cost of their own fame, and the men whose lives depended on the answer had noticed before anyone else in America was willing to. That's the quiet revenge in this entire account, and it's worth naming plainly. Davis never got his vindication by winning an argument. You almost never move a real prejudice by arguing with it, because a prejudice isn't a conclusion someone reasoned their way into, and it won't be reasoned back out. What moves it is results, delivered to the people who can least afford to lie to themselves about them. A bomber crew 40 missions deep cannot pretend. Their lives were the ledger, and in that ledger the red tails came out on top, over and over, until the preference stopped being a matter of opinion. The men Davis commanded didn't talk their way past the doubt. They flew past it, one intact bomber formation at a time, until the doubters were the ones asking them for help. There's a hard-edged honesty this deserves, though, and it's this. Not every grateful bomber crew that remembered a red-tailed savior was actually remembering the 332nd, because that other group flew red markings too, and memory blurs after a war. The legend that grew up later would round all of this up into something cleaner and larger than the truth. It didn't need the rounding. What actually happened was enough. White crews who had every reason, from a lifetime of being taught it, to distrust these men, sat on their base for 5 days, flew under their guns for months, and came to want them, specifically because wanting anyone else was a worse bet with their own lives. By the early months of 1945, the 332nd had become, to the men who rode the bombers, exactly what its commander's airplane had claimed all along, requested, and the American High Command, which had spent 1943 trying to end this experiment, was about to hand the Red Tails the longest, most dangerous, most honored escort mission the 15th Air Force had ever flown. The target was the capital of the Reich itself, and waiting over it was an enemy aircraft faster than anything Davis's pilots had ever tried to protect a bomber from. The mission on the 24th of March 1945 was the longest the 15th Air Force had ever asked its fighters to fly. From the fields of Italy to the capital of Germany and back was a round trip of roughly 1,600 miles. The target sitting at the far end of it was a Daimler-Benz plant on the edge of Berlin that built tank engines, buried inside the most heavily defended airspace in all of Europe. And the group handed the job of shepherding the bombers through the worst of it was the 332nd, the Red Tails, the unit that, a year and a half earlier, the army had tried to send home as unfit. There was something new waiting over Berlin that spring, and it changed the math of every escort pilot's day. The Germans had put the world's first jet fighter into the war. The Messerschmitt 262 came at a bomber stream something like 100 miles an hour faster than anything Davis's men flew. Understand what that speed does to the fight. A piston-engine Mustang trying to protect bombers from a jet is a guard dog trying to catch a car. By the time you saw the jet, it was already firing. By the time you turned, it was already gone, climbing away at a speed you could not match, setting up to come back and do it again. These were the fighters the Red Tails would have to keep off the bombers over the enemy's own capital, at the end of the longest flight any of them had ever made. Davis led them north, hours of it, the coast of Italy falling behind, the Alps, then the flat grey sprawl of occupied Europe, the bombers grinding along at their heavy, patient pace, and the red-tailed Mustangs riding above and around them, close, the way Davis had drilled into every pilot he commanded. Do not leave the bombers. Whatever comes, do not leave the bombers. And what came, as the formation bore in on Berlin, was the jets. They came fast, and they came for the heavies, slashing down through the bomber boxes at a speed that made a mockery of the older fighters. This was the exact moment Davis's entire doctrine had been built for, and it was also the hardest test it ever faced, because now the temptation to break away wasn't about glory. It was about the simple impossibility of catching what you were chasing. A pilot could have been forgiven for deciding a jet was somebody else's problem. The Red Tails didn't. They turned into them. The only way a propeller fighter ever brought down one of these jets was to catch it in a moment of weakness, slowed in a turn, climbing away or lining up its own run on the bombers, and to be diving with every ounce of speed a Mustang could gather. Roscoe Brown saw a Messerschmitt 262 worked the geometry the only way a slower plane can, cut inside the jet's turn, and put it down. Charles Brantley brought down another. Earl Lane brought down a third, 3 of the fastest aircraft in the world, knocked out of the sky over Berlin by pilots flying propellers, by the men America had said couldn't fly. Here is where honesty matters more than legend, and where the true version turns out to carry more weight than the myth ever did. The story that grew up after the war says the Red Tails never lost a bomber to enemy fighters on any mission they flew. That is not what happened, and it is not what happened on this day. The 24th of March was one of the days bombers under the umbrella of the escort went down. The German jets got through in places. Some heavies were lost, some to those jets, and some to the wall of flak thrown up over the target, and the 332nd lost pilots of its own on that long, brutal haul. Nobody flew to Berlin and back through the first jet fighters in history and came home with a perfect ledger. The men who were actually there never claimed they did. Sit with why the true story is the better one. A group that never lost a single bomber is a fairy tale, the kind of clean, rounded number people reach for when the real thing feels too complicated to hold. What the Red Tails actually did is harder, and it is realer. They flew the longest mission of the war, to the most defended target of the war, against a weapon that outran everything they had, and they held their losses down when losing everything was on the table, and they brought down 3 of the jets in the bargain. That is not the achievement of men who were lucky. That is the achievement of men who were disciplined past the point most units break on the day it counted most. The legend sands off the losses to make them look invincible. The truth is, they were not invincible, and they did it anyway. And that is worth more than any myth. For what they did over Berlin that day, the 332nd Fighter Group was awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation. Think about the distance that award traveled. The group that entered 1944 as the only outfit on the strategic runs with no citation to its name, the last in line, the one flying from the goat field with the borrowed fuel tanks, now wore the highest honor a unit could earn, pinned on for the hardest mission in the theater. The men who had been told they could only fail as a race had just succeeded, in front of the entire 15th Air Force, as the best in it. And this raises the question that hangs over every part of what these men accomplished, the one modern historians keep circling back to. How much did the country cost itself, and for how long, by spending years trying to prove these pilots couldn't do the very thing they turned out to do better than almost anyone? The talent was always there. The Army nearly threw it away on the strength of one dismissive report. Every intact bomber the Red Tails brought home was also a small, unanswerable indictment of the machinery that had tried to ground them before they ever flew. They didn't just protect bombers over Berlin. They spent the whole war quietly proving how much a prejudice can blind the people who hold it, right up until the moment their own bombers needed to come home, and suddenly nobody cared what color the fighter pilots were. The war in Europe had a few weeks left to run. The Red Tails would fly it to the end, and when it was over, the men who had flown to Berlin and back would fold up their uniforms and go home to a country that still made them ride at the back of the bus. Everything they had proved in the sky was about to run headlong into everything that hadn't changed on the ground. But the record was there now. It could not be unflown, and the number at the heart of it would end up telling a harder, truer story than even the men who lived it sometimes let themselves tell. When the fighting in Europe ended, the Mustang still carried the 2 words on its side, by request. Davis had lettered them there when they were closer to defiance than to fact, back when the world outside his own group had done nothing to earn the claim. When a unit flying from a goat field with borrowed fuel tanks and no citation to its name had no business calling itself requested. By the spring of 1945, the words had simply become true. The men who rode the bombers had started asking for the Red Tails by name because the Red Tails stayed. The verdict the Army had put in writing in 1943, unfit, unreliable, unable to hold up under combat, had been answered. Not with a speech, not with a protest, but with a request made by the very men whose own lives were the only honest test the question ever had. Here's the thing worth carrying out of all of it. A person, and a whole country, will spend an astonishing amount of effort denying what's sitting right in front of them, and they'll keep it up until the moment the truth becomes something they need. It took the enemy's fastest fighters and their own survival for white bomber crews to finally see what had been flying over their heads the entire time. The deepest vindication these men ever got wasn't a medal, and it wasn't a headline back home. It was being wanted badly by the same people who'd been raised to look down on them. That's a harder kind of proof to argue with than any award, and it's the kind Davis had been quietly building toward from the first mission, one bomber at a time. And the cold arithmetic underneath the legend turns out to weigh more than the legend ever did. The bombers these men protected were never untouchable. On 7 days spread across the war, enemy fighters found the gaps and brought some of them down. About 27 bombers in all, lost while under the guns of the Red Tails. Now set that beside the others. The 6 other fighter groups escorting the same heavy bombers over the same Germany lost on average something close to 46 bombers apiece. The pilots America had tried to send home as unable to fight lost roughly half as many of the bombers in their care as the groups that had doubted them from the start. That's the record. Not a fairy tale of a perfect streak, but a hard number that holds up to any accounting, earned under a weight no other group in that Air Force was made to carry. The story got smoothed over in the retelling. It became a spotless run, a group that never lost a single bomber on a single mission. And even some who were there let the cleaner version stand because it was easier than explaining the truth. The truth was never spotless. It never had to be. Benjamin Davis, the cadet nobody at West Point would speak to for 4 straight years, the colonel the Army tried to ground on the strength of one report, went on to become the first black general in the United States Air Force. The men he commanded flew home to a country that still made them sit at the back of the bus, carrying a record that country had bet everything against and lost. They were forbidden the one thing that makes a fighter pilot famous. They chased no glory, ran up no scores, produced almost nothing the headlines knew how to measure, and they ended the war as the escort the bombers asked for by name, which was the only measure that was ever real.